Building on one of our previous examples, what I've done here is I've taken the box class that we put together previously and I've simply renamed it countable box. Other than that, other than the change in the name for the class, I haven't changed anything else about it. Everything else about it is exactly the same as it was the last time we saw it. To go along with that, I've also now put together a new basic HTML document, PHP script. Up at the top of this particular page, what I do is I require my countable box class, so I'll have the class available for being able to create new countable boxes. Down in the body then, the meat of what's actually here is that I have the instantiation of two new countable boxes. With both of them I did not supply any particular data, so they'll both essentially be default boxes of the default size. I also have echoes for both of them in there. If I actually go and pull that up in my browser, you can see both boxes are being created. Both boxes are returning 10 by 10 as their size. The other two things that I have in my file here, though, is I have a line that says there are X boxes, and then after I create my two boxes, another line that says now there are Y boxes. And right now in the rendered output, X and Y are both not showing up because neither of those two variables have actually been initialized. They're both blank. What I would like to do with my countable box class is I would like to modify it so that I can actually have some value, something that I can put in place of X and Y to show how many boxes I have at any particular time. So the idea is that I want my countable box class to be sort of self-monitoring, where it actually keeps track of how many boxes exist at any particular time. So what I would expect in my final output is that when I ask about the number of boxes before either of the two boxes are created, I would like for it to come back and tell me 0. There are 0 boxes at that point. After the two boxes are created, when I ask how many boxes there are at that point, I would expect it to then tell me 2. So how could I set up my countable box class so that it properly keeps track of how many boxes there are? Well, in the countable box class, what if I simply added a variable in order to keep track of how many boxes exist? If I create a new private variable, maybe I'll call it the count. If I were to then in my constructor set it up so that every time a new box is created when the constructor is called, I could increment the value of the count. Would that be possible? Well, let's give it a try and see what happens. Since I've made count private, I would need to have some way of being able to access it. So what if I created a new public function? I'll just call it getCount, and I'll just have that function return the value of that box's count. Over in my main page, if I tried to make use of that, here where I go to create to show the number of boxes at the beginning, what would I put in there? That's kind of a quandary. Maybe let's skip that one and come back to it. How about down here? There are now blank boxes. What if I go to my CB1 and I call its getCount function so that it'll tell me how many boxes there are? Let's start with just that. If I jump over to the browser, it tells me there's 1 boxes. That's not right. There should be 2 boxes. Maybe I should look at CB2. CB2 was created second, right? So maybe CB1 needs to be created, then CB2 is created after that. So if I ask CB2 how many boxes there are, maybe it will tell me 2. Nope. CB2 also says there's just 1 box. Well, what about back up here on my first echo statement? What could I do there? Well, kind of the problem there is where do I even call the getCount method? I want to say getCount on something, but at that point there's not even a box that's been created yet to call getCount on. Should I create another box first, just so I have a box to call the getCount method on to find out that there are no boxes? But if I did that, there wouldn't be no boxes, would there? There would be a dummy box that I'd created simply for the purpose of calling this function. Overall, as you can see, things are kind of weird. What's actually going on here? Well, part of the problem we have is that when I create a variable, like the variable count I've created here, that's referred to as an instance variable. Same thing down here with something like my getCount function. When I create a function in the way that I've been doing, that's called an instance function. Instance variables and instance functions belong to instances of the class, meaning objects created from the class. So essentially here, it's set up so that every time a new box object is created, that box has its own count, and that box has its own getCount function that returns its count. That's why when I come over and I call getCount on CB2, it returns 1, because the count that it's referring to is a count that is specific just to the CB2 object. CB2 has its very own count variable. That count variable gets incremented when CB2 is created, so its value is 1. It has absolutely nothing at all to do with the count variable that's in CB1. CB1 has its own count variable, a separate variable from the count variable that's in CB2. What I really need is not for each of my boxes to have its very own count variable, but instead I need for there to be one count variable that's shared amongst all boxes. So unlike the width and height, where it's exactly what I want, that every box would have its own copy of width, its own copy of height, with count, I don't want that variable to be individual to every object. I want it to be shared, one single count variable that every box refers to. In PHP, we can do that by including a new modifier called static. If I say that I want the count variable to be static, then what that essentially means is that that variable is attached to the class itself, not to objects that are created from the class. Declaring a variable as static essentially sets it up so that that variable becomes a variable that's shared amongst all objects of the class. So every box that's created from the countable box class will have access to a count variable. There's only one count variable that all of them will share. When we declare a variable this way, it changes how that variable has to be accessed. At that point, it means that we could potentially have a variable that exists even if there are no objects that exist to go with it. That means that we have to then be careful about exactly how we access it. Down here in the constructor, for example, where I want to increment the value of my count variable, I'm accessing it currently through this, which is now no longer possible because this is referring to the current object, but we're saying that the count variable exists outside the scope of any one object. It belongs to the class itself. If I want to access the count now, the way I do it is through a new keyword called self. What I would do is I'd say self, : and then the name of the variable, including its $sign. What this actually is we're talking about the count variable, $count. The : is called the scope resolution operator, kind of like the arrow it means is inside of. So we're saying that the count variable that's inside of self. Self, in this case, refers to the class in which that keyword is used. So if I use the word self in the countable box class, then self means the countable box class. So we're referring here to the count variable that's a part of the class, not a count variable that's a part of an object. So that's the static variable that we're referring to at that point. If I jump back over to my browser at this point and try to run this, I'm going to get some errors. Parse error line 14. On line 14, I still have an incomplete line here. That's where I was trying to do my get count on no object at all. What I should be able to do now, though, what I want to be able to do now, is I want to be able to call get count not for a specific object, but instead for the class itself. So for the class itself, I'm going to say countable box : get count. So kind of like we were doing before in the constructor, I'm talking about the get count function that's inside of, that's a part of, the class called countable box. In the browser, I give that a shot, and it's still not quite right. I'm getting a fatal error telling me this. I'm using this when not in an object context. That's on line 10 of my class. In the class itself on line 10, it's right here that it's referring to it. So I am calling the getCount method, but in that method I'm referring to this, and the problem is this is referring to an object, and the way I'm using it, there's no object. So I'm referring with this to an object that isn't there, an object that doesn't exist. Just like I did 3 or 4 lines down in the constructor, what I need to do here is I need to refer to count properly as a static variable. The way I'm going to do that is I'll refer to $count itself, and I'll do it inside the context of self, inside the context of the actual class. If I give that a try in the browser, still not quite right, but getting closer, it still says there are blank boxes. The problem here is that my getCount function also needs to be made static. Just like we can make a variable static, we can also make a function static. Making a function static allows that function to be called directly on the class itself. Back in the browser, refreshing, still not quite working. Let's go back and see what's happening now. In the actual class, I have my static variable count. I have a function that's static that can be called from the class that returns the value of count, and I have it set up so that every time the constructor for a new box is called, we increment the value of the count. Over in my main class, the class that produces my HTML output, I have an echo statement where I say from the countable box class call the getCount function. I then create two boxes, and then down here I again want to say give me the count from the class itself. So let me paste that in down here below so I do the same thing both times. And that's what I'm ending up with now. It is properly coming back and telling me that there are two boxes. I'm still not getting anything up here for the first one. That's probably just an initialization problem. If a constructor hasn't been called, we haven't added anything to count, so count starts off as nothing, essentially. Let me just initialize count here to 0. So whenever the countable box class is first loaded but no boxes have been created, count will start off at 0. And that seems to do the trick. Now it's keeping track of how many boxes I have. Static variables and static functions can be really useful in classes when you have behaviors that maybe don't necessarily apply to just one specific instance of that class, but apply to all instances of the class, or collections of instances of the class if you want to think of them that way. A lot of times I find myself using things like static variables and static functions in place of creating an additional class. Another way we could potentially, for example, conquer this countable box problem would be to create another class, call it box collection, and we could create boxes through it and store them in it, and it could be in charge of keeping track of the total. But that would then be another class I would have to write, another class I have to maintain. I very often find that static variables and static functions are able to pretty effectively take the place of doing something like that. So they can be great for situations when we want to be able to call some function, some method that has to do with objects, but I don't want to have to be restricted to only being able to call it on objects itself, or in cases where it's just impractical or unnecessary to have a particular object, like here with getCount. As we move forward, there's going to be plenty of opportunities for us to be able to find good uses for static variables and static functions. They all come up pretty frequently and will probably make a little bit more sense in a slightly more realistic context.